The day my grandfather died, I became the wealthiest person in my family. The day his lawyer read the will out loud, I became the enemy. I wasn't expecting it. Honestly, I don't think anyone was, including me. My grandfather, Edmund Harlow, had spent 40 years building Harlow Timber into one of the most respected forestry companies in British Columbia. He'd started with a single logging contract outside of Kelowna in the 1980s and turned it into a regional operation with 3 processing plants, a fleet of equipment, and contracts with lumber yards across Western Canada. By the time he died quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday in February, the company was worth just over $90 million. He left all of it to me, not to my uncle, not to my mother, not to my older cousin who had been working in the company's accounting department for the past 6 years, reminding everyone at every family dinner that she was the one keeping things running. To me, his youngest grandchild, 28 years old, recently relocated back to Vancouver after finishing my master's in environmental law at Dalhousie. The one everyone called the idealist. The will was unambiguous. The estate lawyers, a firm out of downtown Vancouver that my grandfather had used for decades, were methodical and careful when they read it out in their boardroom on the 14th floor of a glass tower on West Georgia Street. My grandfather had left the property, the shares, the operational control, and the naming rights to his sole granddaughter, with a written explanation attached that I will never forget as long as I live. It said in his own handwriting, "She is the only one who ever asked me what the forest meant to me, not what it was worth." My cousin, I'll call her my cousin because that's what she is, even if she'd stopped feeling like family long before that afternoon, sat across the conference table from me with her hands folded on top of her leather portfolio. She didn't move for a long moment after the lawyer finished reading. Then she looked at me the way you'd look at something you'd accidentally tracked into the house on the bottom of your shoe. "There has to be a mistake," she said. There wasn't. My grandfather had told me about the lake house when I was 9 years old. Not this lake house, a different one his own father had built in the Okanagan in the 50s. He'd sit with me on the back porch of his house in Kelowna and describe it in a way that I'd later understand was grief dressed up as memory. He missed it. He'd had to sell it during a bad stretch in the 80s when the company nearly went under, and he never stopped feeling the loss of it. He told me that the worst thing a family could do was let money become more important than the land it came from. I thought about that a lot in the weeks after the reading of the will. My uncle called me 3 days after. He didn't lead with pleasantries. He told me I needed to think carefully about what kind of person I wanted to be, which I understood to mean, give us what we think we're owed. He said my cousin had put in the years. He said I had no idea what it takes to run something like this. He said my grandfather must have been confused in his final months, and that if I had any decency, I'd sit down with the family and make this right. I told him I'd think about it and hung up. That night I called my grandfather's personal lawyer, not the estate firm, but the woman my grandfather had used for 30 years for everything personal. A sharp and methodical woman named Constance, who had offices in Kelowna and who had known my grandfather since before I was born. I told her about the call. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said very calmly, "Don't agree to any meetings without me present. Don't sign anything. Don't respond to anything in writing without running it past me first." I wrote it down. My cousin, her name is not one I'll use here, but I'll say she's 7 years older than me, and she has always worn her age like a credential, showed up at my apartment in Vancouver 2 weeks after the will reading. She didn't call ahead. She buzzed my unit from the lobby at 8:30 on a Thursday morning while I was still in my pajamas with a coffee in my hand. And when I asked who it was, she just said it's me like I was supposed to know. She came upstairs. She sat down in my kitchen without being invited to sit. She looked around at my apartment with the particular expression of someone cataloging evidence, and then she told me she was there because she wanted to talk woman to woman. What followed was 45 minutes of the most carefully constructed manipulation I have ever personally experienced. She started soft. She talked about how much our grandfather had meant to both of us, how she'd spent her 20s working 60-hour weeks to help build something that would last. She talked about her daughter, who was 7, who she wanted to be able to leave something to someday. She cried. I am telling you the tears were real. I watched them roll down her face and I felt the pull of them, that instinct to say it's okay, we can work something out, I don't want you to hurt. But I'd talked to Constance. And before the visit was over, my cousin had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from sad to something else entirely. She started talking about how courts look at these things. She mentioned very casually that there were questions about my grandfather's mental state in his final year. She said she wasn't threatening anything. She just wanted me to understand that if this ended up in litigation, it could drag on for years and that I might want to consider what that does to someone's career when they're just starting out. There it was. I kept my face neutral. I told her I appreciated her coming by and that I'd be in touch. I walked her to the door, I closed it behind her, and then I sat down on my kitchen floor and called Constance and told her everything. She's going to file, Constance said, probably within 60 days. I want you to start putting together everything you remember about your grandfather in the last 2 years. Conversations, visits, any written contact, anything that shows his clarity of mind. I spent the next 3 weekends going through every email, every text message, every voicemail I'd saved. I had a lot. My grandfather had been a meticulous man. He'd emailed me links to forestry research papers. He'd texted me photos of the property in winter with little captions written in his dry, particular humor. He'd left me a voicemail on my birthday the year before he died where he'd talked for 4 minutes about a documentary he'd watched on the ecosystem recovery of old-growth forest in Vancouver Island and then said, at the very end, "Anyway, happy birthday, sweetheart, I left you something. Don't let them take it." I hadn't understood what he meant at the time. I understood now. My cousin filed a legal challenge to the will 8 weeks after the reading. She alleged that my grandfather had lacked testamentary capacity, that he'd been cognitively impaired, susceptible to undue influence, and that I had manipulated him in the final years of his life. I want to let that land for a second. I want you to understand what it feels like to have someone tell a court that the most honest relationship of your life was actually a scheme, that the hours I'd spent driving to Kelowna to sit with my grandfather and talk about trees and water tables and the history of the land, that all of that was calculated. That I had somehow convinced a sharp, privately precise man who had survived 40 years of business negotiations to secretly rewrite his will in my favor, while his family wasn't watching. My uncle issued a statement to the rest of the extended family, an actual email sent to about 15 people, calling me manipulative and opportunistic, and suggesting that I had taken advantage of an elderly man's fondness for her. My own mother called me and said she didn't know what to believe. That one hurt more than any of it. I didn't fight with her. I told her I loved her and that the truth would come out and that I needed her to trust me even if she couldn't quite get there yet. And then I went back to Constance and told her I was ready to fight this as hard and as long as it needed to go. The thing about a legal challenge to a will in British Columbia is that it takes time. The estate litigation process is not fast. My cousin and her lawyer filed the claim. Our lawyers responded. There were examinations for discovery. There were document requests. There were months of procedural back and forth that I won't detail because it would take longer than the story itself. What I will tell you is what happened during those months. Because while the legal process moved slowly, my cousin did not. She was still listed as a signatory on 2 of the company's operational bank accounts, a holdover from her accounting role that had never been formally changed, because my grandfather had trusted her and the transfer of control had been expected to be gradual. She used that access, not dramatically, carefully. Small withdrawals, categorized as expense reimbursements, run through accounts in a way that would look at first glance like normal operational activity. I didn't catch it. Our company's interim CFO did. A methodical woman who had been with Harlow Timber for 12 years and who came to me in May with a printed spreadsheet and a very serious expression and said she wanted to show me something before she said anything to anyone else. I looked at the numbers for a long time. Then I called Constance, and then on Constance's advice, I called the RCMP's commercial crime unit. I want to be clear, I didn't do that out of anger. I did it because Constance told me that if I handled this internally, if I went to my cousin directly or tried to negotiate or let it resolve quietly, I would be complicit in what had happened. The law required a report. The integrity of what my grandfather had built required a report. And honestly, the version of me that had spent all those weekends rereading my grandfather's emails about ecosystem recovery and the long-term health of the land, she was done being gentle about this. My cousin didn't know about the fraud investigation, neither did my uncle. I didn't tell my mother. I kept going to work. I kept meeting with lawyers. I kept my face neutral at every examination for discovery and said what I was allowed to say and let Constance do the rest. There was one afternoon in late June when I had to sit across a conference table from my cousin for a 4-hour examination. She came in dressed very professionally, hair pulled back, a leather portfolio that I recognized as one that had belonged to my grandfather. I don't know if she chose that deliberately. I suspect she did. She sat across from me with an expression of composed moral authority and answered questions about my grandfather's supposed decline with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it carefully. I sat there and I took notes on a yellow legal pad, and I did not say a single word that was not directed to me by the lawyers. 3 weeks later, RCMP officers attended the company's Kelowna office. They seized financial records. They interviewed the CFO. They reviewed 2 years of transaction history on the accounts my cousin had accessed. She was charged in August. I found out about the arrest on a Thursday morning. Constance called me before the news broke anywhere else. She told me what the charges were: fraud over $5,000 under the criminal code, breach of fiduciary duty, a few other things I won't try to paraphrase because I'm not a criminal lawyer. She told me it would be public. She told me it would be in the papers. I was standing in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons in Abbotsford when she called me. I'd stopped on my way out to the Kelowna properties for a site visit. It was 8:15 in the morning, and the mountains were visible at the end of the valley, and the sky was that particular pale blue that British Columbia does in early August when the smoke hasn't come in yet. I said, "Okay." I said, "Thank you." I got back in my car. I sat there for probably 5 minutes. I didn't cry. I don't know exactly what I felt. It wasn't satisfaction, not quite. It was more like something that had been held at an angle for months finally settling into the position it was supposed to be in. A kind of stillness. My grandfather had known what he was doing. He'd known who could be trusted with what he'd built. He'd written it down in his careful, precise handwriting and given it to his lawyers and trusted the process to work. I thought about him sitting on that back porch in Kelowna, describing a lake house he'd had to let go. I thought about how he'd never been bitter about it, just clear-eyed, the way he was about most things. He'd taught me that the land outlasts the people who argue over it, that what matters is what you do with it while it's in your care. The will challenge was withdrawn in September, 6 weeks after the arrest. My cousin's lawyer filed the withdrawal without explanation. No one called me, no one reached out. My uncle sent a single text message to my mother, not to me. That said simply, "I hope this all works out." I thought about responding to that for a long time. I decided not to. My mother called me the same day the withdrawal was filed. She cried. Not performing for an audience, crying, the way my cousin had in my kitchen that Thursday morning. Real, unguarded, ugly crying. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't know what she'd been thinking, letting herself be pulled into it. She said she'd never doubted me, really, not truly, but she'd been scared and she'd listened to the wrong people and she was sorry. I told her I understood. I told her I forgave her. I meant both things. I took over formal operational control of Harlow Timber that October. The board of directors, which my grandfather had structured carefully, with 3 external members alongside family representation, voted unanimously to confirm me as the new majority owner and chair. The 2 external members, both of whom had known my grandfather for years, shook my hand afterward and told me he'd talked about me. I hired an environmental consultant in November to do a full assessment of the company's forestry practices against current provincial sustainability standards. There were gaps, not illegal ones, but places where things could be better, where my grandfather's old methods hadn't kept pace with newer understanding. We started making changes. It is not a perfect company. It was never going to be a perfect company. But it is mine, and I take that seriously in a way that I think my grandfather would recognize. My cousin's criminal case is ongoing. I'm not involved in it. I gave my statement when I was asked to, and I've stayed out of the rest. I don't follow it closely. It's not something I spend a lot of time thinking about. What I think about, more than anything, is that site visit I did in October, my first one as the official owner. I drove out to the northernmost property, a stretch of second-growth forest outside of Williams Lake that the company had been replanting over the past decade, and I stood in the middle of it on a cold, bright morning with my breathmaking clouds in the air, and I looked at the trees that were 20 and 30 years old, tall enough now that they filtered the light coming through, and I thought about my grandfather standing somewhere like this in 1983, with nothing but a contract and a belief that what he was building would last long enough to matter. He was right, it did. And I was the one who was going to make sure it kept lasting. Not because I'd won something, but because I understood, finally and completely, what it meant to be worth trusting with it.